Welcome to another episode of Lessons in Humanities. Today I'm going to be talking about the early years in the new nation. Last class I talked about the Constitution and the difficulties of ratifying it and developing the framework for this new country, which would be the United States. And today I'm going to talk about the early years, the years underneath the presidency of George Washington and John Adams, and the divisive nature of the time period and the development of political parties and the controversies or difficulties the new nation had with other countries like Britain and France, and whether the new nation should support the British or support the French, and see how the country developed and if it would actually last, because people didn't know it would survive in the 1790s. If you're interested in this PowerPoint presentation or this Google Slides presentation or other lessons in history, please click on the link below. So let's begin. So, when the United States began in 1776, it began underneath the Articles of Confederation. So British America had been around for a long time, since 1607, and developed and grew and separated from Britain during the American Revolution. And then developing a new country, a unique framework, was difficult. And underneath the Constitution, it was unclear if it would survive, if the nation would disappear or be overtaken by, for example, the British or the Spanish or even the French. Even though the French helped in the American Revolution, there was some conflicts between the French and the newly developed United States of America. But once it developed, there's going to be a lot of difficulties, and this lesson is going to talk about that. Now, here's a timeline. This is from 1754 to 1800. You can take a look. So from the 7 Years' War in British America would lead to lots of control by the British, which would lead to the American Revolution. So you can take a close look at this timeline if it's helpful. And then the Declaration of Independence would be declared during the Revolution, and a new country would be born. And right now, for this lesson, it's at the later part of this PowerPoint, with the Constitutional Convention being over. Now we have a president. For the first time, there's a president. There wasn't a president for about 10 years. When the country started during the Revolution up into 1789, when George Washington became president. And then this lesson is going to end in 1800. This is the Revolution of 1800, or the election of 1800. So I will discuss that later on in this presentation. This presentation is going to include two presidencies. It's going to be George Washington and John Adams. Now, as discussed in the last class, under the Constitution, you're going to have three branches. You have the legislative branch, which is Congress, which is the Senate and House of Representatives that make laws. There is the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, which is going to interpret laws. And then, of course, there's the executive branch. In the executive branch, you have the president, the vice president, and then you have the cabinet. And in the cabinet, you have people that work for the president, essentially. For example, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of War. And some of these would change over time, but these are three of the major cabinet members inside the executive branch. And for the first cabinet, underneath George Washington, he had to choose qualified people that he trusted. And it should be noted, at this time, there are no political parties. So George Washington wasn't a Federalist or Anti-Federalist or Democratic Republican or or a Whig, or some of the later parties that you'll see in American history, like the Republicans and Democrats of today, he didn't believe in political parties. They were scared of that, right? James Madison was scared of that when he wrote Federalist Paper number 10, warning about factions. So the idea was there's going to be no political parties, but that's not going to last. But at the beginning, George Washington does not belong to a political party. So he's going to choose some members for his cabinet, and two of them are going to be quite opposite. Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, he's going to be one of them. He will be the Secretary of Treasury. Now, during the constitutional debates, he was a Federalist. And a Federalist, and that's not a political party at that time, it was just the Federalists are the ones who supported the Constitution as it was, didn't believe it needed a Bill of Rights, thought a strong central federal government was necessary. And Hamilton he believed in a strong federal government, and he was the Secretary of Treasury. The other one was Thomas Jefferson, and he was an anti-federalist during the debate about the Constitution. And he believed in more of a limited government. He wanted the Bill of Rights. Thomas Jefferson was more of an agriculturalist, while Hamilton was more about commercial and industrial industries, developing those sectors. Now, Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State, right? And these are the people that would influence or give advice to the president. And of course, Washington would take both of their opinions, but he seemed to favor Alexander Hamilton, right? Who was kind of the strong central government character, who was a Federalist during the Constitution. This is going to make Thomas Jefferson very angry. In fact, Thomas Jefferson is going to quit before his time is up, because he feels that George Washington is only listening to Alexander Hamilton. But the important thing is Alexander Hamilton was very influential in the founding of the United States of America. In fact, he was never president, but we've all heard his name, right? So he's very influential. He probably would have been president. He was very strong, but he was not born in the United States of America. He was born in the Caribbean, right? So at that time it was British America, but he was born in the Caribbean, and when he was younger, not too young, he came to the United States, and he met George Washington in the Battle of New York in the American Revolution. But he was, I would say he's very capitalistic. He believed in the government's role to protect private property. He thought that was important. And he did not believe in the distribution of property. He believed that inequality was just a factor of life, right? But very strong central government. In fact, during the Constitution, you had the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan about the type of government that would be the legislative branch of the government and the representation for the people. But he believed in just one strong central government instead of all the states. But that obviously didn't work. But that kind of gives you a picture of what he believed in. But nonetheless, he's going to form the financial system. And George Washington is going to listen to him. And amongst many issues in this very complicated system, I'm going to label or talk about two. And one is he wants to pay off the loans, the debt. The United States at this time, and this is 10 years after the American Revolution, less than 10 years since the Treaty of Paris, he wanted to pay back loans, pay back debt, including the debt from the war debt. So the United States owed a lot of money to France and other countries. Wars are expensive, right? And prior to the Constitution, it was underneath the Articles of Confederation. The United States was very weak, and they couldn't levy taxes. The central government couldn't. The state governments could. And many state governments who were responsible for paying off this debt were behind on the debt. They weren't paying it off, right? And when the Constitution was formed, some people thought that the debt shouldn't be paid at all. They thought, just forget about it. But Hamilton said, no, if we want to have a solvent, strong nation with integrity, where other nations will trust the United States, we have to pay off the debt. So his idea was that the federal government would combine all the debts and the loans from the states and and pay off the debt to create federal loans or bonds. The second thing he wanted to create was a national bank, the first bank of the United States. So in different capacities, this was very controversial. I'll talk about that. Well, first of all, paying off the debt, that shouldn't be controversial, right? But it was. For example, in the South, many states had already paid off their debt. They were, I guess, more responsible, or maybe they had less debt, but they paid off their debt. But many states in the North had not. So states in the South said, well, why is the national government, why are we going to help the national government pay off the federal debt and help the northern states when we paid off our debt? Okay? But nonetheless, this was what he suggested, and George Washington is going to listen to him. Now, the national bank was even more controversial and always has been in American history. So, first of all, the national bank, that's where you deposit the federal money, or gold or silver, into this bank. And you need to have money to spend to run a government. Also, they were going to print money. So during British America, there was lots of difficulties with the money. Different states had different money, and different states wouldn't accept money from other states. And some of it was not backed by gold or silver. So they printed too much, and it lost its value. So, and then also during the Revolution, you had the Continentals, which was not worth a continental, which means the money became worthless, right? And that can happen. We see that throughout history. Just look at Zimbabwe and Venezuela today. But he was going to print money, and he was going to be backed by specie. Now, this word is important. Specie means gold or silver. So money is, back then, it was not like money is today. Money today really is just paper. And why do we trust it? And we trust it for numerous reasons. One, for example, the US dollar is strong, backed by a strong government with big weapons. And people just know that if they give somebody their money, they will get something in return. So I will accept your money because I can go buy something, and somebody else will accept it. So there is trust, really. And will that trust remain? That's to be seen if the government keeps printing money. But right now it's strong. But back then, and at different times in American history and world history, money was backed by gold, and it was really like a note that said, I own this much gold. So when you go to the bank, you bring in this note and says, okay, give me my gold, give me my silver, right? Or I could take that note and buy something, and that person could give me some chickens or a chair or whatever they want to sell me, and they could take that note to the bank, or they could use it to buy things. That was kind of the idea. And eventually, money wouldn't be like that. I can't go to the bank and say, okay, give me my gold. They're going to look at me like I'm crazy. I can go buy gold, but that's different. That's purchasing it, right? But it's not representative of gold or silver. But at this time it was. And just like paying off the loans, this would make the newly developed, very fragile country stronger. Now, people didn't like the first national bank. They didn't like a national bank. They wanted small state private banks. And Thomas Jefferson was among them. He thought it was too big government. He was more of a small government person. He didn't want a strong central government. And you have to remember, at this time, it was shortly after the American Revolution. And many of the early Americans and founding fathers were wary of a strong controlling government like the British government. And that's why they created the Articles of Confederation, to make it a weaker federal government, so they wouldn't be controlled and taxed, overly taxed, without representation like they were with the British. And there's many people at this time that still wanted that small government in the 1790s. And fast forward to 2020 and beyond, people still feel that way in some senses, libertarians and whatnot. But Thomas Jefferson, in addition to saying it would give the central government too much power, he also said it was not constitutional, right? And Hamilton argued that it was an implied power. So it didn't say in black and white, the new government can form a national bank. But he said it was implied of the powers of the different branches. Nonetheless, constitutional or unconstitutional, George Washington approved a 20-year charter. So it's going to be the first national bank from 1791 to 1811. In 1811, James Madison's going to close it because he was kind of a small government person. Even though he was originally a Federalist, he's going to become a little bit more anti-Federalist or Democratic-Republican. I'll talk more about the political parties later. But he's going to decide just a few years later that he needs to open up a second one because of the War of 1812. So in 1816, he's going to open up the second national bank. And then Andrew Jackson is going to close that 20 years later. And then we won't have a true national bank until 1913 with the Federal Reserve, which is the national bank today. Okay? But you see this continuity in American history, this need or the feeling that's unnecessary of having a national bank, the controversy over it, people wanting to stop the national bank or end the Fed, the Federal Reserve. It's always been there. But nonetheless, at this time, we have, in the United States, the first national bank. Now, to pay off the loans, the federal bonds, and all this war debt, the federal government needs money. And where are they going to get money? Well, they got to collect taxes. Now, keep in mind, it's not that long ago at this time that the Americans or the colonists at that time were fighting the British because they were being taxed too much, among other discontented issues at the time. But collecting taxes without representation was a big issue. And now that the Articles of Confederation has failed and we have the Constitution, the American government has to collect taxes, right? Maybe they look back and say, oh, maybe the British really had to do that. Maybe we understand their point of view. I don't know. But they got to collect taxes. It's just a necessity to pay off these loans. And one way to pay back these taxes or pay back these loans is to collect taxes on whiskey. Now, this is grain is a valuable cash crop for farmers at that time. And a cash crop is basically using these crops as money, in essence, right? Many things have been money: gold, silver, whiskey, tobacco, many things. Shells, obviously. But grain was amongst them. And it was also valuable to distill and to make whiskey. And keep in mind, at this time, whiskey was kind of the poor man's drink. Today, whiskey can be very expensive if you buy some very fine whiskey. But back then, it was wine that was expensive. At this time, whiskey was quite cheap. And a farmer could afford it, or at least use it to make money or to survive, right? So he's going to pass the first domestic tax underneath the Constitution. It's going to pay off the war debt. And it's going to be very unpopular. See, the poor farmers in the West and other places, but the poorer people in the United States of America, it's going to hurt them the most. Not the elites in Boston or Charlestown. And it's going to really divide the country between the West and the East, between the poor and the rich or the elites. And people are going to fight back. And in Western Pennsylvania, the farmers are going to rebel. And they're going to do a lot of things that you saw during the American Revolution: tarring and feathering, burning down little local tax collecting houses. They're really going to terrorize Western Pennsylvania. And in fact, it's going to be 2 years where it's going to be difficult to collect any taxes from that area. Now, if you recall Shays' Rebellion, and if you don't recall Shays' Rebellion, please watch my last video. It was on the new nation and the Constitution. But this happened during the Articles of Confederation in the 1780s. And this happened also in the western part of Massachusetts. So this west-east divide, poor-rich kind of divide at this time. And over there was a rebellion, and taxes and debt was part of this rebellion. And because the Articles of Confederation was so weak, the federal government couldn't stop that rebellion. Fast forward to the Whiskey Rebellion. And in the Whiskey Rebellion, well, now they can. Now they're stronger because they have an army, and now they can collect taxes, and they are going to be able to stop this rebellion. And that's the important point here. So if you're taking an American history class, AP or any American history class, comparing the Shays Rebellion during the Articles of Confederation and the Whiskey Rebellion during the newly developed nation underneath the Constitution, you really see a dichotomy, a difference. The similarities of why they're fighting, but how the federal government responded and was able to quell or to stop this rebellion. Now, a couple interesting notes about the the Whiskey Rebellion is this was the first and only time an American president, a sitting American president, would lead his troops into battle. So he led 13,000 troops to western Pennsylvania, and they were going to fight these rebels in western Pennsylvania. Now, Washington just led them there and turned around and went back to the capital. In fact, another interesting note is he put in command a guy named Henry Lee. And think about who his son might be, because there's going to be a civil war, 60, 70 years later. And his son is going to be Robert E. Lee. So that's just another interesting note. And also it should be noted that George Washington on Mount Vernon, during the end of his presidency and when he retired, he distilled a lot of whiskey. He had a lot of slaves, and they worked on his plantation in Virginia on Mount Vernon, and they helped him make whiskey, and it made him very rich. Now, at this time, there's lots of problems with Britain. Obviously, we know that the Americans probably didn't think too much of the British because they had just fought a war, the American Revolution. They were not happy with the British while they were British during those last 10 years leading up to the war. But there's going to be continued problems with the British, and Britain is still a very powerful country, obviously. And the United States is not a powerful country, right? At this time, it's not clear if the United States will survive. But Britain and France are constantly fighting. They had been before, and they still are now, right? They were fighting in the 7 Years' War. They were fighting in the American Revolution. There's also the French Revolution, and the British are involved. So the British are constantly fighting the French. And remember, the British, they are Anglican or Protestant, not Catholic, while the French are Catholic. And of course, that Anglican or Protestant tradition is going to be part of the newly developed United States as well. But there's some other problems. So with the fighting with the French, the British are going to need more people for the Navy to fight. And where are they going to find it? Well, they're going to go into the Atlantic Ocean, and they're going to attack American ships, and they're going to take Americans and make them fight the French. Now, often the time they jumped on these ships to look for other British Navy men who were running away from their duty to fight the French. But other times they were stealing Americans or kidnapping Americans. Maybe it was an accident, maybe it was on purpose. But nonetheless, the Americans were very angry at the British for this. And there's other problems. After the American Revolution, many of the British soldiers stayed in their forts, in their military bases in the western part of the United States. They never left. So just imagine the soldiers of another country in your country. So that's going to make the Americans angry as well. And they were also trading with the Native Americans. So when they're trading with the Native Americans, they are selling them or trading with them weapons. And those weapons are being used by the Native Americans to kill Americans, right? So understandably, the Native Americans whose land is being taken over by Americans settling west, well, they would be attacked by Native Americans often. Or Native Americans would go east into little villages and sometimes massacre small villages because they wanted to protect their land and they didn't want to be encroached by the Americans. But these are the three things, in addition to their discontent over the American Revolution, but the conquering or the what we call impressment of Americans into the British Navy, the troops in the forts in the West, and also the weapons being sold to the Native Americans. So there's lots of problems with the British. But the Americans want to stop this, but they also want to trade with Britain, especially the people in the Northeast, the Federalist type of people, the strong government people, the industrial, commercial people. They wanted to to trade. It was very profitable. So they didn't want to just go to war with Britain, which they're going to do in 1812, but that's for another lesson. They want to have a good relationship with them. But there's a big controversy because a lot of people hate the British. So they don't want to do anything with the British. They want to help the French, right? Think about the French. The French helped the Americans during the American Revolution. Without France, there is no United States of America. And at this time, there is the French Revolution. So some Americans said, let's go support the French like they supported us. They were fighting a monarchy, King Louis XVI, and they were putting in a republic. And remember, the United States is a republic. So many people, especially the anti-federalist type of people, wanted to help the French, while the kind of the industrial federalist type of people, they wanted to help the British. Or not necessarily help the British, but they wanted to have a good relationship with the British and prosper from this relationship. And George Washington, who's going to follow Alexander Hamilton, not Jefferson. Jefferson would support the French. Hamilton is going to be more supportive of doing business relations with the British. He's going to listen to Hamilton. They're going to send a guy named John Jay over to Britain, and they're going to negotiate. And they're going to basically say, cut it out. Stop impressing our people into the British Navy. Get out of the forts. Pay us back for our merchant ships that you attacked. Stop selling guns to the Native Americans. So he's going to kind of negotiate. And then let's trade. Let's be friends. That's what John Jay is going to do. And George Washington and Hamilton agree for John Jay to go over there. Now, John Jay is one of the Federalists who wrote the Federalist Paper. Alexander Hamilton wrote some. James Madison wrote some. They wrote most of them, and John Jay wrote a few of them. But now he's going to be famous because of the Jay's Treaty. So he goes over there, and while many people wanted to help the French, he's going to go and make a treaty with the British, and George Washington is going to sign this treaty. And in this treaty, they're going to agree to pay back some of the lost money from the merchant ships, and agree to continue trade with America, so both sides can prosper economically. Right now, the British are going to continue to jump on ships and take some people later on, but that's just a side note. But the important thing here is this is going to infuriate people in America. Not everybody. There's some Federalists or big government type of people that are very profitable from the trade with the British are not going to be angry, obviously. But a lot of people are going to be angry. And John Jay is not going to be the most popular person. And if you look in this picture on this slide, that's Jay. That's not really John Jay. That's an effigy, like a doll of him, where people were burning it. And throughout the country, you would see John Jay effigies or pictures being burnt and hung, right? It was all over. So the anger was real. People really were not happy about this treaty. But it's about this time that we start to have political parties, because we already have this divide in the country over certain issues. Big government, small government, national bank, no national bank, British, French. Some of these issues are really dividing the country. And in these early years under George Washington, the country was very divisive, very separate, very chaotic, very, very opposing to each other, right? And of course, during the Constitutional Convention and the ratification of the new Constitution, you had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists wanted a strong central government. They supported the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists wanted a weaker, limited central government or federal government, and they wanted more individual rights or states' rights. So there's already a division, but those were not political parties. But they're going to kind of turn into political parties, right? And the Jay's Tree is going to kind of help that happen because the country is so divisive. And as George Washington didn't have any political affiliation with a party, he didn't believe in it. He did support Hamilton more, so many people will say he was a Federalist. But these are going to be the two first political parties. It's going to be the Federalists and the Democratic-Republicans. So generally speaking, the people who are Federalists during the constitutional debate are going to join the Federalist Party because they believed in a strong central government. They believed in a national bank. They wanted to support the British. They kind of shared those ideals. Much like the political parties today, the Democrats and Republicans, they have ideals that they tend to gravitate to, right? And the other party is not the anti-federalists, but a lot of those anti-federalists would become what would be known as the Democratic-Republicans. And the Democratic-Republicans, they're more agriculturalists. Small, limited government, individual rights. They wanted to support the French. So right now, at this time, during George Washington's presidency, we do see the first two political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic-Republicans. Now, you're probably looking at this and saying, okay, which ones are the Democrats and the Republicans of today? Neither. Okay? You can't really compare it to today. Surely, you know, with big government and government's role in people's lives, there's some similarities, and we can find those. But don't look at these parties and say, okay, these are the first Democrats and these first Republicans. That's not true. Okay? It's going to change, right? We're going to have the Whigs, and we're going to have you know, the Know Nothing Party and the Bull Moose Party and some smaller parties that never really make a big difference, right? But eventually it will lead to the Democrats and Republicans that we have today. But at this time, it's the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. And if you are interested in knowing the political parties where the Democrats and Republicans came from, well, Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, or about 1829, is considered the first Democrat. And so that's a little bit later. That's about 30, 40 years later from this time. And they would come out of the Democratic-Republican Party. So some people will say the Democratic-Republicans and Thomas Jefferson were the first Democrats. Some people will argue that. So, but other people will say, no, it's Andrew Jackson in 1830s. And as for Republicans, that's 1861 with Abraham Lincoln. Okay. But don't get confused about the political parties. Right now, we have the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, and they're not the Republicans and Democrats of today. Democratic Republicans, in some of your history books, you might see this as the Republicans or the Jeffersonian Republicans. All are okay. In these lessons that I'll be doing for the next year about American history, I'm gonna refer to them as the Democratic Republicans until they turn into the Democrats, because I don't want people to get confused between those Republicans and the Republicans of today, because it's different. All right, so I already mentioned that there are problems with the British, but there's also problems with the French. Now, the French are the Americans' friends. As I mentioned earlier in this video, no France, no United States of America. The Americans, or the colonists, or founding fathers, could have never defeated the British Empire back in the mid-1700s, 1770s, without the help of the French. It would have been impossible. So there was a treaty signed between the French and the Americans, the newly developed Americans, that they would help each other. Now, of course, that treaty was signed with the French monarchy. And it should be noted that the French didn't necessarily help the Americans because they liked the Americans. It was more that they hated the British. And if you're French, please comment below. I'd love to hear your perspective. But the French Revolution. Now, of course, this lesson is from the American perspective, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But it was not many years after the French soldiers returned to France that there would be a revolution in France. And you have a strong monarchy with King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette living a very nice life in the Versailles Palace. And people were poor and struggling on the outside, and they didn't really seem to care. They're just spending more money. Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake. You know, while these people are starving, while she's having all these cakes and beautiful dresses and making Versailles all pretty. So naturally, a revolution would ensue. And the rebels would dismantle the monarchy and install a republic. And it would get pretty nasty. Something would be called the Reign of Terror, where people would not trust each other, and they were cutting people's heads off. Thousands of people's heads would be cut off, including the king, Louis XVI. Just a side note, France was very interesting at this time period because it went from a monarchy with a king and queen to a republic, which was similar to the US. But then you have Napoleon, so then it goes to a dictatorship, and then it goes back to a monarchy, right? So French history is fascinating. But nonetheless, from the American perspective, a lot of people wanted to help the the French. They didn't want to do Jay's Treaty. They're angry at Washington and Hamilton and Federalists. I can say Federalists now because we do have two political parties. They're unhappy about this, and they want to go support the French. They said they helped the Americans in the French Revolution, so the Americans should help them. Now, of course, it was the monarchy that was helping the Americans, not the Republicans who were fighting the monarchy. And that treaty was kind of out of date because it was signed with the monarchy, which has been taken out, right? And it should be noted that the United States, even though it was becoming stronger underneath Hamilton's financial system and George Washington, it was still a very weak, fragile country without a proper navy and enough soldiers and money to go over and help, right? And George Washington believed in what was called the Proclamation of Neutrality. He talked about it when he left office. He didn't believe the United States should get involved in external affairs. Now compare that to America and then the 20th and 21st century is quite different. But that was the initial idea. So the beginning of the French Revolution, there's a lot of support for the French and for the revolution. But when they cut off the king's head and the Reign of Terror began and people in the streets were having their heads cut off, the tide turned in the United States where they did not want to support the French. Because it was too brutal. It got too out of control. And the relationships between the United States and France did deteriorate. So this ally, this friend that helped make the United States, the relationship was going to have some problems in the 1790s. So at this time, just imagine the United States is having a problem with the British. They had to sign the Jay's Treaty and the French. So it was very, very fragile times, and people were worried about being infiltrated by the French, right? And many ships were being attacked by the French. The French attacked American ships just like the British did, and they did that in retaliation for Jay's Treaty because the French weren't happy about Jay's Treaty as well. But the French also sent people over. They sent ambassadors that were trying to influence George Washington and the American people to support the movement in France. And there's one person, his name is Sedition Act. And if you're French, please help me with my pronunciation. And he came over and he asked George Washington to go against the Spanish in Florida to help fight this French Revolution, which was much wider than just France. And Washington refused. So Citizen Act went to the public, and he would gather lots of people and encourage merchants to go attack ships and whatnot. And this made people very angry and other agents. So Americans started to really distrust France. They thought they were infiltrating the United States and trying to rile people up to revolt. And this, in addition to what was happening in France, the death toll and the Reign of Terror, really turned people against supporting France, except for the hardcore Democratic-Republicans like Jefferson. Many people were not in favor of it anymore. And they were suspicious of people in the United States if they're like French agents trying to rile up, some type of discontent or some type of revolution in the United States to help with the revolution in France. And as I said, they were attacking ships in the Atlantic Ocean. So that's the last point on this slide. The American merchant ships must have been very dangerous at that time, being a merchant ship in the Atlantic. You're being attacked and brought into the British Navy, or you're being attacked by the French. And there's going to be a new president, and the new president is John Adams, and he's going to send some people over, right? So after 8 years, I should mention, George Washington, he retired. He won his election in 1796. Before that, 92. In 96, he could have been the president again, but he chose not to. He wanted to retire in Mount Vernon and distill his whiskey and be with his family. And he could have kept going. He could have done 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, 16 years, as long as he got elected. But he stopped at 8 years, and it became a tradition in American history where all presidents would stop after 8 years no matter what. It wasn't in the Constitution. They could have been president for life as long as they were elected in. But he decided to stop, and this became a tradition until Franklin Delano Roosevelt did 4 terms when he died. And this would lead to an amendment making it only 2 terms. But nonetheless, George Washington's out, and John Adams, another Federalist, is the president. And the country is deeply divided about all the issues, big government, small government, Britain or France, and just suspicious of the French in America. And in response to the American ships being attacked, he sent some people over. And in Congress, on some documentation, they were labeled as X, Y, and Z without their names. And when they got to France, they were humiliated. They were bribed. They're like, you want to talk to the leadership and make a negotiation to stop this? You got to pay us some money, right? Or we'll kidnap you. Or they kind of challenged them, right? And the important point here is while this was very common in Europe at that time, the Americans were not used to it and they were insulted. So this further disrupted the relationship between the Americans and the French. It's continuing to deteriorate, and it's going to lead to a small war. It's called the French QuasiWar. Quasi kind of means not really or fake. It wasn't a big war. It was all in the Atlantic Ocean with the navies near the Caribbean and different parts of the Atlantic Ocean. But there was just this sense in the South, especially, that the French who were in the Caribbean, some, Haiti and different islands, would come up and attack the mainland or infiltrate with more agents on the mainland and maybe start a revolution of the African slaves in the South. And of course, in the North, they're more Federalist and they supported the British more anyways because they're trading with them. So basically, the relationship with the French had deteriorated by this time. And there's going to be a war that not many people know about. And it's called the French QuasiWar. And not a lot of people would die. But there is going to be some fighting between the Americans and their allies, the French, who had just helped them. So that's kind of ironic. But yeah, that's the French QuasiWar. So in retaliation for the QuasiWar, the XYZ affair, and all this sentiment in America, and this fear about what would happen if the French infiltrated the American government, or what happens if there are French sympathizers who support the French Revolution are going to attack the American government. There's a lot of fears at this time. So John Adams, a Federalist, a strong government Federalist, he passes what is known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the Alien and Sedition Acts, with all this paranoia spreading throughout the colonies, he's going to pass this, and it's going to say, for example, the Alien Acts, it says if there's any foreigners that are causing a threat or posing a threat in America, they would be deported. So he didn't deport very many, but he said he would. That was the first part. That wasn't as controversial as the Sedition Acts. So sedition is going against the government. That could be with violence or with words. And this said basically citizens who are engaged in false or scandalous speech against the government or against John Adams would be prosecuted, right? So you couldn't speak freely. Free speech, the First Amendment, was threatened. And in fact, there were some Democratic-Republicans, which was the opposite party of John Adams, in Congress that were arrested. There were some printers that were arrested. And this seems completely un-American to what we know as the United States today. But you have to realize back in the 1790s, it was a new country, and free speech didn't really mean what it means today. It would develop into that, where you could say stuff, whatever you want. You can criticize the government and the president as much as you want, especially today, of course. But back then, some people thought, well, okay, yeah, you can say whatever you want, but if your speech is going to cause problems, that's taking away liberty from other people. That was kind of the idea. So some people say, yeah, you can say whatever you want, but you can't say whatever you want if it's going to cause more trouble. And this is going to be very controversial because remember, the Democratic Republicans were fighting for those individual rights, for the Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution. And now they have them, but it's not being followed, right? And people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who used to be a Federalist, who's now a Democratic Republican, they're gonna fight back, and they're gonna pass what is known as the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and they're gonna say basically the government was limited in their powers that was expressed in the Constitution, and the states could also declare if a law is unconstitutional. So they're gonna really become constitutionalists, right? They're going to say, you got to follow the Constitution. You can't do this just because you think it's necessary. It's unconstitutional. So that's an important word, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And I would just like to make another note. Before that, Jefferson actually said something like, you got to be careful of false speech, which is kind of ironic. It's not something you would think you would hear from Thomas Jefferson. And right now he wouldn't say that at this time, right? And it might be partisan political move, right? Because nobody wants. I mean, I think we all agree that if you're lying or you're saying something that's not true, we don't want that either. But where's the boundaries between free speech and libel or saying stuff that is not true? It has always been and always will be a controversy. But nonetheless, this was a clear violation of the First Amendment. And that's going to make John Adams president just for 4 years. He's going to lose the next election. There's going to be an election in 1800. And it's going to be a big election. And spoiler alert, he's going to lose. It's going to be Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic-Republican, his big rival at this time. But this is the important part. So this brings us to the Revolution of 1800. And revolution just means change, right? It doesn't have to be a war or blood or violence. And that's the election of 1800 because up to this point in history, most transfers of power have been done through violence or war or revolution, with fighting a revolution. And with the Federalists and Democratic-Republicans being so divisive and separate and vitriolic at each other, there was a fear that if the Democratic-Republican Party, which is the opposite of John Adams and the Federalists, won, that there would be a revolution or there would be some fighting. And maybe the country would be split or it would not survive. They didn't know if it would survive at this time. But the good news is Jefferson would win, and John Adams would lose. And when Jefferson won, there was no fighting. It was peaceful. John Adams gave up. He surrendered, and we have a new president, Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. And this gave confidence to the Americans, because they knew that the new system, even though there was no political parties in the Constitution and people didn't really want that at the beginning, especially George Washington, it showed that this new system could actually work. And every 4 years, people had more and more confidence that there could be a peaceful transfer from one party to another party, or from one party to another candidate in the same party. And there will be times in American history where there is fear of what might happen during the election, including 2020, many years later, right? But this did give some confidence that there could be a peaceful transfer of power. And that is what is known as the Revolution of 1800. Now, another interesting note about these two people, John Adams, the Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic-Republican, is that they were founding fathers. They were very integral, important in developing this new country, in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, in the early years of this new nation, this new republic. And they were friends, but then at this time they became enemies, bitter enemies that really hated each other because of their political differences as a Federalist and a Democratic Republican. And they remained enemies for a while, but after they both were out of office and they grew older, they became friends again, and they were writing letters to each other. One was in Virginia, right, Thomas Jefferson. The other one was in Boston, Massachusetts, John Adams. Very far apart, and it wasn't easy to communicate. They had to send letters, and it would take days to get there. But they communicated back and forth, and they really became friends. But they were still competitive. And 50 years later, after the Declaration of Independence, on July 4th, 1826, they were both very old. They both died on that exact day, 50 years to the day of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. They both died. And what is interesting is the last words, supposedly, I'm not sure if it's true, but supposedly the last words are among some of the words he said that day from John Adams was, "Jefferson still survives." But little did he know that Jefferson had already died a couple hours earlier. So that's an interesting story. But nonetheless, we have a new president, Thomas Jefferson, which is the small government president, and you'll find that he is really not that small. He's actually kind of a bigger government. Louisiana Purchase, for example. But he said he was a small government president. But one important case, I'll just mention it here, is the Marbury versus Madison. This is going to happen when John Adams transfers his power to Thomas Jefferson. And right before he did, he elected these midnight judges. And it went to court because the Secretary of State, James Madison, underneath Thomas Jefferson, would not deliver those papers because he did it at the last second. And it went to court, and should he deliver the papers and allow these judges to become judges or not? I'm not going to go into those details, but the most important part about Marbury versus Madison is what happened at the end was Marshall, the Supreme Judge, he said that, okay, it is the duty of the judicial branch to decide if a law is constitutional or not constitutional. That's the important point, without all the details of what actually happened in the case. This was the end result. It's called judicial review. So in 1803, with the passing of this Marbury versus Madison, that's what was an important part about this. One of the most important cases in American history is now it's decided that the judicial branch, the third branch, one of the three branches of government, decides if something is constitutional or not. So you can't just pass the Alien Sedition Act or some acts like that without the judicial branch saying, yes, you can pass that, or no, it's not constitutional. Whether we like it or not, we can't. It's not in the Constitution. We have to interpret the Constitution. So that's the judicial review. But we're going to go into the 1800s. The United States is going to grow and move westward and go to civil war and then become a very strong, powerful nation in the 20th century. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you got this far, I really appreciate it. I hope you've clicked the link below and obviously given me a thumbs up. And subscribe to my channel, and also write some notes below. I love to keep the conversation going. If you have questions, or if I said something wrong or something you disagree with, or possibly maybe I looked at it from too much of an American perspective, because that's part of studying history is taking it from different perspectives. And obviously this is American history, which I'm teaching in this channel. And a lot of it is looking at it from the American perspectives, but there's many different perspectives. So please, if I didn't represent your perspective from a different country or religion or political point of view or ethnicity, please, I'd love to hear your opinion and we can continue the conversation. And please look out for my next lesson. All right, thanks.